The village of Old Hollow sat at the bottom of a valley where the sun took its time arriving each morning and left early every evening, as if the mountains themselves wanted to keep the place hidden from the rest of the world. It was a small village, maybe 40 families, mostly farmers and shepherds, people who grew their own food and mended their own clothes, and rarely saw a stranger from one season to the next. And that was exactly how the elders liked it. Because Old Hollow had a secret, and the secret had a name, even though nobody outside of a dozen trusted households was allowed to say it out loud. Wren. She was 19 years old, though nobody in the village would have guessed her age just by looking at her, because looking at her properly was something the elders had spent 7 years making sure nobody could do. From the time she was 12, when her mother noticed the way strangers passing through on trade routes would slow their carts just to stare a second longer than they should have, the elders decided something had to be done. They didn't do it out of cruelty, they did it out of fear. Everyone in the valley had heard the stories about the alpha packs from the north, the ones who came down from their mountain territories every autumn looking for tribute, or workers, or wives. The stories were not always the same, but they always ended the same way: a village losing someone it loved and never getting her back. So the elders made a decision, and the decision became a tradition, and the tradition became the only life Wren had ever really known. They rubbed ash into her cheeks every morning until her skin looked dull and gray. They cut her hair short and rough, the way boys wore it, and dressed her in clothes 2 sizes too big so her shape disappeared into loose folds of wool. They gave her chores that kept her outdoors and covered in dirt, feeding the goats, hauling water, stacking wood, because dirt was armor and armor was safety. And it worked. For 7 years, it worked. Nobody in Old Hollow ever spoke her name where a stranger might hear it. If anyone from outside the valley asked about the family with no daughter, the answer was always the same, rehearsed until it came out smooth and easy. There's no girl here. Never was. Wren grew up believing this lie the way other children believed, in seasons changing. It wasn't something she questioned. It was just the shape of her life. She stopped looking at her reflection in the well water sometime around 13, because there was no point looking at something everyone had agreed didn't exist. She learned to walk with her shoulders curled forward and her chin down. She learned to speak in short sentences, in a voice pitched low, because a girl's laugh carried too far in a quiet valley. By 19, she had almost forgotten there was another way to live. Almost. Some nights, when the goats were settled and the village was asleep, she would sit by the stream that ran past the edge of the pasture and let her hair down from the tight knot she kept it in during the day. She would watch the water move over the stones and imagine, just for a few minutes, what it might feel like to walk through a market square without ash on her face. To be looked at, not stared at like an object, but seen, the way people are seen when they matter. She never told anyone about those nights. Some things you keep only for yourself, especially when everything else about your life belongs to other people's decisions. The morning it happened started like any other. The autumn air had turned sharp, the kind of cold that bites at your fingers before it reaches the rest of you, and Wren was out in the east pasture chasing down a goat that had decided, for no reason she could understand, that this particular morning was the morning to test the fence. "Get back here," she muttered, mud soaking through the hem of her oversized trousers as she ran. "You ungrateful, 4-legged menace." The goat did not care about her opinion of it. It bolted across the frost-hard field, kicking up clumps of dirt, bleeding like it had somewhere important to be. Wren chased it past the tree line, past the old stone marker that supposedly indicated the edge of village land, and out onto the wider dirt road that connected Old Hollow to the rest of the world. A road the village rarely used, because the rest of the world was exactly what they were trying to avoid. She didn't hear the horses until they were almost on top of her. By the time she looked up, there were 6 of them, tall animals with dark coats, ridden by men in black cloaks that moved like they had been carved from shadow instead of fabric. And in the center, on a horse larger than the others, sat a man who did not look like he belonged to the same category of person as anyone else on that road. Wren froze. The goat, finally showing some sense, darted off into the underbrush and left her standing there alone, ash-streaked and breathless, in the middle of a road she had no business being on. The man on the largest horse looked down at her, She had heard, in whispered stories passed between village women who thought children weren't listening, that alpha wolves had a particular way of looking at people, a stillness before the recognition, like a predator deciding whether something was worth its attention. She had always imagined it would feel like being hunted. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like being found. "You have soot on your face," he said. It was such a strange thing to say, in that voice, in that moment, that for a second, Wren forgot to be afraid. She reached up without thinking and wiped at her cheek, which of course only smudged the ash further, streaking it across her jaw instead of removing it. Something crossed his face that might have been amusement. That made it worse. "I wasn't expecting an audience," she said, and immediately regretted it, because girls who had spent 7 years being taught not to be noticed did not talk back to strangers on horseback, especially not strangers who rode like they owned the road beneath them and possibly the sky above it too. But he didn't look offended. If anything, he looked more interested. He swung down from his horse in one motion, boots hitting the frozen dirt without a sound, and crossed the distance between them before Wren's mind had caught up with the fact that this was happening. He was tall in a way that made the space around him feel smaller, and up close, the stillness she'd noticed from a distance resolved into something more specific, a kind of attention that felt like it was being aimed directly at her, and nothing else. He crouched slightly, the way you might crouch to look more closely at something you didn't want to spook, and studied her face with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. "How long," he asked, quiet now, "have they had you looking like this?" Wren didn't answer. Some questions don't have answers you're ready to say out loud, even to yourself. That was when the shouting started. Elder Finn was the first to reach them, red-faced and out of breath, 3 other village men close behind him, all of them wearing the particular panic of people who have spent years preparing for a disaster and are now watching it happen anyway. "My lord," Finn gasped, bowing low enough that his forehead nearly touched his knees. "Forgive the intrusion. That's my grandson's boy, tending the goats. He's not," the man on the road repeated, without turning around, still looking at Wren, "has a great deal of soot on his face for a boy." Nobody said anything. "And," he continued, standing to his full height now, and something in his voice had changed, gone colder, quieter, the kind of quiet that makes a room feel like it's shrinking. "Boys, in my experience, do not have voices like that." Elder Finn's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. "My lord, I assure you, don't." The word landed flat and absolute, and Finn actually flinched. "I have ridden through 11 villages this season. I have heard every version of this lie there is to tell, and I am tired of being told it by men who think a crown makes me stupid instead of simply patient." He turned, finally, to look at the gathered elders, and Wren watched something pass over the group of them, like a cold wind moving through dry grass. "You hid her." Nobody answered. "You took a person," he said, and his voice dropped even further, "and you erased her. Like she was contraband, like she was something dangerous, instead of someone alive. We were protecting her," one of the other elders finally managed, an old woman named Osa, who had been on the council longer than anyone could remember. "My lord, you don't understand what it's like, down here, when the packs come through." "I understand exactly what it's like," he said. "I have spent my whole life around men who think a woman's face is something to be claimed instead of simply hers. That is precisely why what you did wasn't protection. It was a smaller version of the same crime." Wren stood very still through all of this, feeling strange in a way she didn't have words for yet, like she was watching her whole life get argued over by people who weren't actually asking her opinion, which was, she realized slowly, exactly what had been happening for the last 7 years. "What's your name?" he asked her, turning back, and his voice had softened again, like the anger had a door he could close on it when he wanted to. "Wren," she said. It felt strange in her own mouth, saying it out loud to someone who wasn't family, like handing over something fragile. "Wren," he repeated, and something about the way he said it made it sound like a different word than the one she'd grown up with. Heavier, more real. "I'm Cassian." He didn't say king, he didn't say Alpha, just his name, plain, like he was giving her something back in exchange for what she'd given him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, "and I'm not going to let them keep hurting you either, even if they call it kindness." "They're not," Ren started, some old loyalty rising up out of habit, but the words died before she could finish them, because she genuinely didn't know how to finish that sentence. "They're not cruel" felt true, and also felt like exactly the kind of thing someone says about people who have controlled every visible part of them since they were 12 years old. Cassian seemed to understand the unfinished sentence better than she did. "You don't have to defend them," he said. "You also don't have to hate them. You just have to decide, for the first time in what sounds like a very long time, what you actually want." Nobody had ever asked Ren that question before. Not once. In 19 years. She looked past him, at his men waiting on their horses, at the elders frozen mid-panic, at the mountains rising up gray and endless behind all of it, the same mountains that had hidden her for 7 years, like she was something shameful instead of something whole. "I want to see my own face," she said finally, and her voice shook a little, but she said it anyway. "I don't even remember what I look like without the ash." Something shifted in Cassian's expression, something that looked almost like pain, quickly covered. "Then that's where we'll start." He didn't drag her away. He didn't have to. When he offered his hand, palm up, patient, she was the one who chose to put her own hand in it. The ride out of Old Hollow felt like leaving a dream, the kind where you're not sure until you wake up whether the thing you're leaving was ever real at all. Ren sat in front of Cassian on his horse, wrapped in a cloak one of his men had given her. Soft, heavy fabric, nothing like the rough wool she'd worn her whole life, and watched the only home she'd ever known shrink behind her until the mountains swallowed it whole. Nobody spoke for a long while. The horses moved at an easy pace, hooves striking a steady rhythm against the frozen road, and Ren found herself studying her own hands like they belonged to a stranger. Ash-stained knuckles, calluses from years of hauling water and chopping wood. Hands that had done a great deal of work and had never once been allowed to be looked at. "You're quiet," Cassian said eventually, his voice low behind her. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say." "You're not supposed to say anything. I just noticed." She glanced back at him, just briefly, and found him watching the road ahead rather than her, which she appreciated more than she expected to. There was something about the way he gave her space without disappearing that made the whole strange situation feel slightly less like falling. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My territory. 3 days' ride from here, unless the weather turns." "And when we get there?" He considered the question longer than she expected. "That depends on you," he said. "I'm not bringing you there to put you in a different kind of cage. You'll have rooms of your own, people who answer to you, and nobody who tells you to cover your face or lower your voice." That sounds like a fairy tale. Most fairy tales leave out the part where the girl has to learn to trust the person telling it, he said, and there was something dry in his tone, almost self-deprecating, that surprised her. "I'm not expecting you to trust me today. I'm only asking you to let me prove it, a little at a time." They stopped for the night in a clearing beside a wide stream, the 6 guards setting up camp with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. Ren sat near the fire, wrapped in her borrowed cloak, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, nobody told her to sit further back, to keep her face down, to make herself smaller. She found the change unsettling in a way she hadn't expected. Being unwatched, when you've spent 7 years being deliberately unseen, feels less like relief and more like standing on ground that might not hold your weight. Cassian settled across the fire from her, close enough to talk, far enough to give her room. "You keep touching your face," he said. She hadn't realized she was doing it. Her fingers had found their way to her cheek again, testing the skin there like she was checking for something that used to be there and now wasn't. "I'm not used to it being clean," she admitted. "Does it feel strange? It feels like touching someone else's face." She laughed, short and a little embarrassed. "That sounds ridiculous." "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire instead of her, which somehow made it easier for her to keep talking. "They used to say it was for my own good," she said. "The ash, the clothes, all of it. And maybe it was, in the beginning. Maybe there really were raiders who would have taken me if I'd looked like this. She gestured vaguely at herself. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about protecting me and started being about controlling me, and I don't think anyone in that village ever noticed the difference. I'm not sure I noticed it either, until today. That's the trouble with fear, Cassian said. It's very good at disguising itself as care, and once people get comfortable making decisions for someone else, they rarely notice when they've crossed from protecting that person into simply owning them. Is that what you do? To the people in your territory? It was a bold question, and she watched something flicker across his face. Not offense, but consideration, like he was actually taking the question seriously instead of brushing it off with the easy confidence of someone used to being obeyed. I try not to, he said finally. I don't always succeed. Power has a way of convincing you that your judgment is better than everyone else's, and sometimes it is, and sometimes that's exactly the kind of thinking that turns a leader into the same thing your elders became, someone who decides what's best for people without asking them. He looked at her directly then, firelight catching the sharp lines of his face. I'd rather ask, even when it's inconvenient, even when the answer isn't the one I want. And if I say I want to go back, then I take you back, he said, without hesitation. Tomorrow, if that's what you decide, I won't pretend that wouldn't disappoint me. But it wouldn't change what I do. Ren studied him for a long moment, trying to find the lie in his face, and not finding one, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had. I don't want to go back, she said quietly. I just don't know what I want instead. That's allowed, Cassian said. You're allowed to not know yet. Nobody's asking you to have the answer tonight. They rode for 2 more days, through changing country. The flat gray fields around Old Hollow giving way to rolling hills, then thicker forest, then finally the beginnings of the northern mountains, where Cassian's territory sat like something carved directly out of stone. Ren watched the world change around her with an attention she hadn't been allowed to give anything in years. She noticed the way the light moved differently through pine trees than it did through the scrub brush back home. She noticed birds she didn't have names for. She noticed, mostly, that nobody along the road looked at her the way strangers used to look at her back in the valley, not with the hungry, assessing stare she'd been warned about her whole childhood, but with simple curiosity, quickly passing, the way people look at anyone new. It took her most of the second day to understand why. She was riding beside the Alpha King. Nobody in their right mind stared too long at anything that close to him. Is that why nobody's looking at me strangely? She asked, when they stopped to water the horses. Because of you? Partly, Cassian admitted. Mostly, I think, because you're not hiding anymore. People stare at things that look like they're trying not to be seen. It draws the eye, oddly enough. Confidence does the opposite. I don't feel confident. You don't have to feel it yet. Sometimes you borrow it until it's actually yours. By the time they reached his territory on the evening of the 3rd day, Ren had stopped flinching every time someone looked directly at her. It was a small thing, maybe, but it felt enormous, like putting weight on a leg that had been broken for years and finding, to her surprise, that it held. Cassian's home was not what she expected. She'd pictured something cold and fortress-like, all stone and shadow, the kind of place that matched the stories she'd grown up hearing about alpha packs. Instead, it was built into the side of a mountain, wood and stone together, warm light glowing from dozens of windows even in the fading evening, smoke rising from more chimneys than she could count. It looked less like a fortress and more like a village that had decided to grow upward instead of outward. It's not what you were expecting, Cassian said, watching her reaction. No, she admitted. It's not. Good, he said. I'd rather surprise you than disappoint you. The next several weeks passed in a blur that Ren would later struggle to fully remember, not because nothing happened, but because so much happened, all of it new, all of it demanding a kind of attention she hadn't used in years. She was given her own rooms, actual rooms, plural, more space than her entire family's house back in Old Hollow. A woman named Ilsa, brisk and kind in equal measure, was assigned to help her adjust, though help mostly meant answering Ren's endless questions and gently correcting her instinct to apologize for taking up space. You don't have to say sorry every time you ask for something, Ilsa told her, on the third day, after Wren had apologized for requesting a second blanket. This is your home now. You're allowed to want things in it. Old habits, Wren said. I know. We'll break them, one at a time. She learned to eat at a table instead of standing by the hearth. She learned that her opinion, when asked, was actually wanted rather than merely tolerated. She learned, slowly, painfully, the strange work of looking at her own reflection without flinching. Ilsa had set up a proper mirror in her room, silver-backed and clear, and for the first 2 weeks Wren avoided it entirely, catching only glimpses out of the corner of her eye like it was something dangerous. It was Cassian, in the end, who convinced her to actually look. They had fallen into a habit, the two of them, of walking together in the evenings along the ridge above the main hall, where the view stretched out over the valley below and the wind carried the smell of pine and wood smoke. It wasn't a formal arrangement. It had simply started happening, one evening becoming a pattern, the pattern becoming something neither of them commented on directly, but both of them clearly looked forward to. You still won't look at yourself, he said one evening, not accusing, just noting it, the way he noted most things about her. Carefully, like he was collecting information he intended to use gently. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel when I do. You're not supposed to feel anything in particular, you're just supposed to see what's actually there, instead of what you were taught was there. And what was I taught was there? Something dangerous, he said. Something that needed hiding. Something that made you a target, instead of a person. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The valley spread out gold and orange behind him in the last of the evening light. I don't see any of that when I look at you, Wren. I see someone who spent 7 years being told her own face was a liability, and who still, somehow, didn't let that turn her bitter or brittle. That's not nothing. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something worth being proud of. Wren felt her eyes sting, unexpectedly, and looked away toward the valley so he wouldn't see it. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, it's just true. He reached out, slowly enough that she could have stopped him if she wanted, and tucked a piece of hair back from her face. Not with any grand gesture, just a small, ordinary kindness. You don't have to believe it tonight. I just want you to hear it, so that when you're ready to believe it, you already know it's been said. That night, for the first time since arriving, Wren stood in front of the mirror in her room and actually looked. It took a long time, longer than she expected. She traced the shape of her own face like she was meeting someone new, which, in a way, she was. The face that looked back at her wasn't the face she'd built her identity around avoiding. It was just a face, ordinary, in the way all faces are ordinary once you stop treating them like evidence in a trial. There were faint lines already forming at the corners of her eyes, from years of squinting against sun and wind and worry. There was a small scar near her jaw from a childhood fall she barely remembered. There was nothing dangerous in any of it. There never had been. The danger, she realized slowly, had never lived in her face at all. It had lived in the fear other people carried, and they had made her carry it for them, for 7 years, without ever once asking if she wanted to. She cried that night, not out of sadness exactly, but out of something more complicated. Grief for the years she'd spent believing a lie about herself, and relief at finally being allowed to stop. The following months brought a kind of steadiness Wren hadn't known she was capable of feeling. She began to find her place in Cassian's territory, not as a hidden thing kept safe in a tower, the way some old stories might have written it, but as someone genuinely present in the daily life of the place. She learned the names of the kitchen staff and the stable hands. She began helping Ilsa organize the household stores, discovering along the way that she had a surprising talent for it, an eye for efficiency that came, she suspected, from years of managing scarce resources back in Old Hollow. She and Cassian did not rush anything. There was no dramatic declaration, no single moment where everything shifted from uncertainty into certainty. Instead, there was simply an accumulation of small things, evening walks along the ridge, quiet conversations by the fire, the particular ease of a friendship that hadn't yet decided what else it might become, though both of them, if pressed, would probably have admitted they already suspected the answer. There were difficult days, too. Not every part of adjusting to a new life is gentle. There were nights when Wren woke from dreams about Old Hollow, about ash and rough wool, and the particular exhaustion of making herself smaller, and had to remind herself, hands pressed against the unfamiliar softness of her own bedsheets, that she wasn't there anymore. There were moments when a stranger's stare, even an innocent one, sent a jolt of old fear through her, before she could remind herself that she was allowed to be seen now, that being seen wasn't the same thing as being in danger. Cassian never rushed her through those moments either. When she told him, hesitantly, about the dreams, he didn't try to fix them or explain them away. He simply listened and told her that some fears take longer to unlearn than others, and that there was no schedule she had to meet. "You spent 7 years learning to disappear," he told her once. "Nobody expects you to unlearn that in a season." "How long did it take you," she asked, "to learn to be, whatever it is you are, comfortable with being looked at, being in charge, all of it?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things she asked him. "I'm not sure I ever fully did," he admitted. "I think most people who carry responsibility carry some doubt along with it, whether they show it or not. The difference is, I was never taught my presence was dangerous. You were. That's a much harder thing to unlearn than simple nerves." It was late in the spring, nearly a full year after the day the goat had bolted and changed everything, when Cassian asked her to walk with him to the same ridge where they'd had so many of their evening conversations. The valley below was green now instead of gold, the mountains softened by new growth, the whole world looking, Wren thought, considerably less frightening than it had the first time she'd seen it. "I want to ask you something," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, he sounded genuinely uncertain, which she found strangely endearing given how steady he'd been through every other difficult moment of the past year. "Ask," she said. "I'm not going to pretend this is a simple question, or that the answer doesn't matter enormously to me." He turned to face her fully. "I know how this began. I found you in a village that had spent years hiding you, and I brought you here, and there's a version of this story where that makes everything between us complicated, in ways that are hard to untangle. I don't want you to answer this out of gratitude, or obligation, or because it feels like the expected next chapter of a story. I want you to answer it only if it's true. Ask," she said again, gently this time. "Do you want to stay?" he said, "not because this is where you were brought, but because it's where you actually choose to be. And not just this place. With me?" Wren looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had never once, in the entire year she'd known him, made her feel like anything other than a person whose choices mattered. "I've thought about it," she said, "more than you probably realize. And the truth is, I don't know who I would have become if that goat hadn't run off that morning. Maybe I'd still be in Old Hollow, still hiding, still believing I was something to be ashamed of. I don't know, but I do know who I've become since, and I like her. I like the person I am when I'm not being told to make myself smaller." She reached for his hand, an easy, natural gesture that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "So yes, I want to stay. Not because you found me, because I choose you, now, with my own eyes open, knowing exactly what I'm choosing." The wind moved through the valley below them, carrying the smell of spring and new growth, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Wren felt entirely uncomplicatedly present in her own life. Not hidden, not erased, not a secret kept for someone else's comfort, but simply, fully herself, standing in the open, exactly where she wanted to be. Back in Old Hollow, the story of the girl the village had hidden became something the elders rarely spoke of, and when they did, it was in quieter, more careful tones than they'd once used, less about the danger she might have brought them, and more about the shame of what they'd taken from her instead. It became over the years a kind of quiet lesson passed down through the village, though nobody ever agreed on exactly what the lesson was. Some said it was about the foolishness of trying to control fear instead of facing it honestly. Others said it was simply about a girl who deserved better than the life she'd been given, and who, against every expectation the village had built around her, went out and found it anyway. Wren herself rarely returned to Old Hollow, though she did, eventually, once the old wounds had softened enough to make the visit bearable. not to punish the elders who had hidden her, and not to forgive them entirely either, but simply to show them, plainly and without ash on her face, exactly who she had become. She didn't need their approval anymore. She hadn't needed it for a long time, but there was something quietly satisfying, she found, in letting them see it anyway. The girl they'd spent 7 years insisting didn't exist, standing in front of them fully seen, fully chosen, and entirely, unapologetically herself.